Welcome to the final day of the book of Leviticus. We're wrapping it up today, chapter 27. We've finally finished the holiness code, the holiness instructions, and now we're on to the instruction on the vows. Now, these vows, I'm going to be honest, this is probably what I understand the least in the book of Leviticus. As difficult as the last video was, as difficult as that passage was, this is some of the details here are just a real struggle as far as really grasping what all is going on here. But we're going to do our best, and we're going to look through chapter 27. Now, in chapter 27, this is the final chapter. You can see right here on the board, this is, you could say, a diagram of the structure. Some people might call it a chiasm, which is where the middle point is the emphasis, and then the points going out from that in parallel are related to each other. So sacrifice is the first section. The last section is on vows. And these are both related to what you're giving to God. The sacrifices are pretty much the animals, but the vows, that does include animals sometimes, but it can be more monetary. But they're both commitments to God. Well, then you have the cleanness, the clean and unclean. You have all those laws. And you have the holiness laws. And those are parallel in a lot of ways because you have the same idea being brought forth. You have this idea of being separated from sin. But how can we be separated from sin? We need to be committed to God. We need to be separated from sin. But we can't do it on our own. We are imperfect, so we need that Day of Atonement. We need someone who can cleanse us from our sins, someone who can be the ultimate sacrifice to take away the sin of all of the things we've done, all of who we are. And so that Day of Atonement, all of this points to Jesus, but that's kind of the preeminent thing here. And that's really the pinnacle of Leviticus. And so you can go back and watch that video if you missed that one. I'll link that one below, the thing on Yom Kippur, or a Day of Atonement. And this, though, if you want to kind of think of in very short, small terms, so that, instead of a big old diagram, that's just a pretty simple way of thinking of Leviticus. And so we're finally on the vows. We're on that last section. So it's pretty short because it's just one chapter, but it's very important because it's part of the Bible. And so here, when we're looking at these vows, first of all, just the last thing actually in the chapter is on tithes, but that's the first thing we'll talk about. Tithes, a lot of people may be vaguely familiar with tithes. Perhaps you tithe to your church. What exactly is a tithe? A tithe, with that word in the Hebrew, is derived from the word for 10, for a tenth. So if you have, let's say you've got 10 dimes. This is actually how we explain it to my young kids, how they do their tithing. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 dimes. Right, so $1, 10 dimes. Okay, so if you have 10 dimes, 1/10, 1 dime, that's the tithe. Then the rest of it you use, in whatever way you use the rest of the money. Maybe you give, if this is an analogy for what we're reading here, maybe you have some sort of free will offering, some extra vows. When it talks about here special vows, maybe you're giving more than that. Maybe it's 2 more dimes. Or, maybe it's not financial, maybe it is an animal. It talks about that as well. But that's what's going on there's the tithe that's separate from these vows. And that's perhaps why it mentions the tithe at the end there. Like, these are special vows, not the tithe. I think maybe a way of looking at this in modern day, sometimes people that are Christians, that go to church, that care and follow the Bible, they will take their money, they'll say, I need to tithe, I need to give 10%. But they'll say, and so I'm going to give it to this organization that's a good organization that's taking care of people, or maybe even that's, giving to the gospel. Maybe they say, I'm going to give it to this mission group or something like that. But as well-meaning as that may be, if you're following this pattern, the tithe, 10%, is separate from that, because the tithe is for, in this case, the priests, God's people who are that are representing him, that are leading his people in their form of worship. That needs to go to the church. If you're tithing, I would say this is an indication of going to what today would be the church. There's this extra stuff, these extra vows that they have, and that's great. And if you give your tithe and you say, I have more money and I want to give it to this group or this group or this group, great. But those are two separate things. And so here we're looking primarily in chapter 27 at these special vows. Now, these special vows are something above and beyond. That's the way to think of it, I guess. In the beginning of this, we see what seems to be, again, this is kind of difficult for me to even, I'm still kind of wrestling with understanding exactly what's going on in this first details here, but it seems like it's for work that they're going to do. So maybe they're saying, I will go work at the temple or in this case, they don't have the temple yet. So at this point it would be the tabernacle, but moving forward, the temple, I will go serve there. But you can only serve in certain ways or certain people to do certain things. So maybe you can't serve in whatever capacity, or maybe as we saw that the priests could only serve when they were doing the sacrifice and stuff. That it's got to be the priests. When they do other things, even they have to meet certain qualifications just physically, like they can't be diseased and things like that. Maybe you, for some reason, cannot actually work. You can't actually do that service. And so there is an amount of money that you can give instead that then, okay, well, I can't actually do that, but I can give you this money that kind of equates to that. And that's why the money is different for different people, I think. That you have basically the people who would be paying the most are the basically men in their prime. And that's going to be because they're going to be able to do more of the labor. They're assumed to be able to do more of the work because they are probably going to be stronger and able to do more of that stuff that's being asked of them in a quicker manner, something like that. Whatever the case, they got to pay more. If you're a man in your prime, you got to pay more. And if you are a woman, or if you are younger, or if you are elderly, then it's less. There's just these different amounts of money that you can pay instead of your actual working at the temple. Of course, we do know that there are people that did volunteer and work at the temple. There were not just men too, but there were women, and we saw that, we will see that when we get to a little later, when we get to the time of the judges, creeping into the book of Samuel. So, 1 Samuel, some of the priests there, they are these two brothers. They're off doing stuff they shouldn't, and it kind of talks about that and references some women that are serving at the temple. And so we see that in a number of places. And so this is something where someone could be serving at the temple. You could actually serve at the temple permanently, but you might just pay this amount of money instead that then goes to the temple to serve, and perhaps maybe use that money to hire somebody else. I don't know. But that's the first part of the vows, and it's got to do with that. Then you also have not just here's my money for my time or work or whatever, but here's money in place of an animal, or perhaps just the animal itself, vowing an animal. And you can't, in some circumstances, vow an animal and then switch it out and say, oh, I'll pay this money instead. Sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you have to just you have to give the animal. And if they find out that you switched it out, then they keep the animal you switched it out for, and you still got to give that animal, because that's the law, that you have to give the animal you vowed to give. So you might end up, if you aren't following that, then you end up having to give twice as much. But there are times when you can give money instead. You say you were going to give this thing, but now you're going to give something else, some money, and then you have to give what its value is plus 20%. Whatever they valued that monetarily at, plus 20%. And so you got to give more. In order to redeem that, you got to give even more. And so that's pretty much most of the rest of that chapter is talking about when you have these animals, if you vow them, how you can redeem them, if you can redeem them, and what that process is. And again, this parallels what we saw with the sacrifices at the beginning. This is part of their worship. This is how they are giving to God. And this actually, practically speaking, this last chapter helps us understand how they could support financially the tabernacle and eventually the temple. The ways that you ended up having finances for them, or you had these animals, then they could sell the animals. So all of this, there's a practical element right then and there in the midst of it, but we don't want to forget that the Bible is never just practical. The Bible is never just something's never in the Bible just because, that's just, they just needed to know that at the time. Because there's plenty of things they needed to know at the time that aren't in here. There's other books that the Bible references that talk about other things, but the Bible has what it has in there for a specific reason. It's for our benefit. It's not just for the benefit of the people that are there at the time. So when we read through Leviticus, as we've just gone through, there's so many parts where you may say, I don't understand, I don't get it, what's going on? And even just think, this doesn't apply to me. This doesn't have anything to do with me. This was just something they needed to know back then. But that's not the case. And the more we study it, and the more we learn from it, the more we will see Jesus in it. The more we will see how it points to us worshiping Him for what He has done. Most significantly in this book, I think, the Day of Atonement. But not only that. This is, as I've said many times, the pinnacle. But there's all these other things that also point us to Jesus throughout the whole book. That wraps up Leviticus. We're done now. Moving on to Numbers. It's been great going through Leviticus. And I know it's hard for a lot of people. It's not something that's the book that I naturally understand the most, but I've tried to spend a good bit of time in it to understand it better. And that's not always easy, but it's good because all of the Bible teaches us about Jesus. All of the Bible is useful and good for us, and not just for the people at the time that it was written, but for us as well as God's people. So we'll see you next time as we begin Numbers. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.